I found them by accident, not in some dusty government archive or leaked document cache, but sitting in plain sight at the Library of Congress. Maps from 1899, extraordinarily detailed, showing American cities in a way that doesn't match what we're told about that era. Street grids perfectly laid out, infrastructure that shouldn't exist yet, buildings marked with precision that suggests surveying technology we supposedly didn't have. And here's what made me pause. These weren't exploratory sketches or rough drafts. These were insurance maps, created by the Sanborn Map Company, meant to assess fire risk and property value. They needed to be accurate because money depended on it. But when you compare what they show to the accepted historical timeline of urban development, things don't line up. The Sanborn maps documented over 12,000 cities and towns across North America between 1867 and the early 1900s. Each map shows individual buildings, construction materials, street widths, even the location of windows and doors. The level of detail is obsessive, and that detail reveals something nobody talks about: a pattern. In city after city, the maps show buildings with ground floors that sit below current street level, basement windows that weren't originally basements, doorways that now require stairs leading down instead of up. The standard explanation: cities raise their streets over time for better drainage and utility access. Gradual urban development. Nothing unusual, except the pattern isn't gradual, it's uniform. When you examine maps from different cities hundreds of miles apart, you see the same architectural anomaly repeated with eerie consistency. First floors converted to basements, original entrances buried, street levels elevated by 8, 10, sometimes 15 feet, and the timing clusters around the same narrow window. The 1880s and 1890s, right when these maps were being drawn. I started comparing photographs from the late 1800s to the same locations today. Buildings that once sat at street level now appear sunken. Windows that faced pedestrians now face soil. And in many cases, you can see where new facades were added to cover what's beneath. Not restored, covered, as if someone wanted to hide what the original ground level looked like. This isn't speculation. The photographic evidence exists in public archives. Before and after images showing dramatic changes to street levels that supposedly happened naturally, but somehow affected entire city blocks at once. Then I found something that changed how I understood these maps entirely. Notes in the margins, surveyors marking depths, measurements indicating how far down they had to excavate to reach what they called original foundations. In some cases, 20 feet or more. They weren't building new cities, they were uncovering old ones. The Library of Congress holds over 5 million maps. Most people never see them. The online collection represents a tiny fraction of what exists in physical storage. I requested specific maps from the 1890s, focusing on major urban centers. What arrived surprised me, not because of what the maps showed, but because of what someone had tried to obscure. Sections marked under construction, with no explanation. Areas labeled fill, without specifying what was being filled or why. Street grids that appeared complete in 1890 maps, but showed up as planned in documents from just 5 years earlier. The timeline didn't work. According to official history, American cities grew organically through the 1800s. Wooden structures gave way to brick and stone. Streets were paved gradually as populations increased. Infrastructure developed in stages as technology advanced. That's the narrative. But the Sanborn maps suggest something different. They show infrastructure appearing suddenly, entire neighborhoods with mature development showing up in surveys with no corresponding records of construction. It's as if the cities were already there, waiting to be documented rather than built. Look at Seattle. The standard story says the Great Fire of 1889 destroyed the city, and residents rebuilt on top of the ruins, raising the street level in the process. That's why Seattle has an underground city today. Tourists visit it. The the story makes sense. Except the Sanborn maps from 1888, before the fire, already show buildings with basement levels that match the current underground. The elevation change happened before the supposed catalyst. The fire didn't create Seattle's underground, it revealed it. Portland shows the same pattern. San Francisco, Denver, cities across the American West display identical characteristics in late 1800s maps. Ground floors that aren't ground floors, street levels that don't match foundation depths, infrastructure that appears complete without corresponding construction records, and nobody asks why. The official explanation, repeated in every city's historical society, blames urban renewal and modernization. Cities needed better drainage. Streets were raised to prevent flooding. Buildings were modified to accommodate new infrastructure. All reasonable explanations for individual cases. But when the same modification happens simultaneously across thousands of miles, in cities with completely different geography and drainage needs, reasonable becomes suspicious. What makes the Sanborn maps particularly valuable is their purpose. These weren't artistic renderings or approximate sketches. Insurance companies needed exact measurements to calculate risk. A building's construction material determined its fire insurance rate. Wood cost more to insure than brick. The distance between structures mattered. The width of streets affected how quickly fire could spread. Every detail had financial implications, so the surveyors were meticulous. They measured everything, and what they measured doesn't match what we're told about 19th century American construction. The maps show buildings made of materials that shouldn't have been readily available. Structures using construction techniques that supposedly hadn't been developed yet. Street layouts displaying geometric precision that would require surveying equipment more advanced than what officially existed. I'm not talking about rough approximations. I'm talking about perfect right angles, uniform block dimensions, and infrastructure spacing that suggests centralized planning on a massive scale. The kind of planning that requires technology, coordination, and resources that don't appear anywhere in the historical record. Then there's the grid itself. American cities built during westward expansion supposedly developed organically, following natural geography and property boundaries. But the Sanborn maps reveal something else. Underlying grids that ignore topography. Street systems that cut through hills and valleys with geometric regularity. Infrastructure that seems designed first, then imposed on the landscape rather than adapted to it. It's backwards from how cities are supposed to develop. I found myself asking a question that felt absurd at first. What if these maps weren't documenting new construction? What if they were documenting excavation? What if the fill marked on so many maps wasn't referring to material being added, but to material being removed? What if American cities in the 1890s were being dug out rather than built up? The evidence keeps pointing in that direction. Photographs from the 1890s show construction crews doing something strange. They're not building foundations. They're clearing dirt away from structures that already exist. Images labeled new construction show workers excavating around buildings that appear complete, just buried. The photographs exist in public archives. The Library of Congress has hundreds of them, but they're catalogued as construction photos, not excavation photos, even though excavation is clearly what's happening. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. If these cities were being excavated in the 1890s, then they must have been buried before that, which means something covered them. Something deposited enough material to bury multi-story buildings, something that happened on a scale large enough to affect the entire continent, but somehow left no clear record in official histories, unless the record was deliberately obscured. The maps themselves might be that record. Not what they show, but what they don't show. The gaps. The sections marked unknown or undeveloped in areas that earlier maps showed as complete. The sudden appearance of new infrastructure that matches the style and materials of supposedly much older structures. The notes in margins that reference original grade and previous foundations without explaining what made them previous. I started tracking specific buildings through sequential sand-borne maps, following the same structure from 1880 through 1900. What I found was disturbing. Buildings that appeared in 1880 surveys disappeared from 1885 maps, then reappeared in 1895 surveys labelled as new construction. The same buildings, same locations, same architectural details. But officially, they were built twice. Once in the early 1880s, then again in the mid-1890s. That's not how construction works. Unless the first version was buried, then excavated and documented as if it were new, the timeline keeps collapsing. The more maps you compare, the more the official chronology of American urban development falls apart. Cities that supposedly took decades to build appear fully formed in maps from the early 1880s. Infrastructure that required years of planning and construction shows up complete in surveys just months apart. And underneath it all, literally underneath, in the case of buried first floors and sunken entrances, lies evidence of something that came before. Something we've been taught to ignore or explain away as normal urban evolution. But there's nothing normal about thousands of buildings across an entire continent, all sinking into the ground at the same time, during the same narrow window of years, for supposedly unrelated reasons. The sand-borne maps weren't supposed to reveal any of this. They were business documents, practical tools for insurance assessment. But their very practicality makes them reliable. The surveyors had no reason to lie or embellish. They were recording what existed so companies could calculate risk. And what existed doesn't match the story we've been told about how and when these cities were built. Something happened in the late 1800s. Something that buried existing infrastructure, then required massive excavation efforts to uncover it. The maps document that excavation. They just don't call it that. The official explanation for buried first floors is simple. Cities raised their street levels. It happened gradually over decades as urban planners improved drainage and accommodated new utilities. Perfectly reasonable. Except when you look at the timeline, it doesn't work that way. Street level changes in most cities are documented. London raised certain streets between 1850 and 1900. Paris did similar work during Haussmann's renovations. These were major civic projects that took years, involved public debate, required massive funding. They left extensive records, engineering reports, budget documents, newspaper coverage of the disruptions. American cities supposedly did the same thing, except they did it simultaneously across thousands of miles with no coordination, no shared planning, and remarkably little documentation for such massive undertakings. Seattle famously raised its streets after a fire in 1889. That story is well documented because it was unusual enough to warrant documentation. But Seattle's street raising explains Seattle. It doesn't explain San Francisco, St. Louis, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, and dozens of smaller cities all showing the same buried first floor phenomenon during the same narrow time period. You can find the official explanations if you look. Improved drainage, better sewage systems, flood prevention. Each city has its specific reason, but when you map them all together, when you see the same solution appearing in the same decades across completely different geographical and political contexts, the individual explanations start to feel like excuses rather than causes. Portland, Oregon, has buried sidewalks beneath the current street level. Tour guides will tell you the city raised its streets to prevent flooding from the Willamette River. Practical engineering. Except the buried sidewalks extend into areas that were never at risk of flooding. The buried structures appear in neighborhoods built on elevated ground where drainage was never a problem. The maps show something else. In the 1880 Sanborn survey of Portland, certain buildings appear with their entrances at grade level. The 1890 survey shows the same buildings with their entrances now accessed by stairs descending from the new street level. Between those two surveys, supposedly, the city undertook a massive public works project to raise entire districts. Where's the documentation? Not the explanation that it happened, the actual project records, the contracts, the engineering surveys, the budget allocations, the public complaints about years of construction disruption. They exist for some cities. Seattle has them. Chicago has extensive records of raising the street grid. But most cities don't. Most cities just have the evidence that it happened, paired with vague explanations that it must have been for drainage or utilities, without the paperwork that such projects would inevitably generate. Here's what's strange. The buildings that show buried first floors aren't random. They cluster in specific districts, usually downtown commercial areas, usually in sections built with a particular architectural style, and usually in buildings constructed with materials and techniques that supposedly weren't available when those buildings were allegedly built. I found engineering reports from the 1890s describing excavation of existing structures in city centers, not construction, excavation. The language is careful, technical, descriptive. Workers were uncovering buildings, not building them. But the reports are filed under construction projects. The bureaucratic categorization doesn't match the described work. There's a photograph in the Chicago Historical Society archives. Dated 1893. It shows a crew of workers on a city street. They're surrounded by equipment. Behind them is a building, clearly visible, clearly complete. The caption reads, "Construction crew, new municipal building, State Street." But the building in the photograph isn't under construction. It's finished. The workers aren't building. They're digging, excavating around a structure that's already there. The photograph contradicts its own caption. These contradictions appear everywhere once you start looking. Newspaper articles from the 1890s describe new buildings in terms that don't make sense for new construction. They mention original foundations and previous materials without explaining what made them previous. They reference reconstruction of buildings that have no documented prior construction. The language itself is revealing. When you read enough of these accounts, you notice the writers struggling to describe what they're seeing. They use words like restoration and renovation and reconstruction for buildings that officially didn't exist before. They're trying to fit observed reality into an accepted framework, even when the fit is awkward. Want to see something disturbing? Compare photographs of major American cities from 1870 to 1900. Not paintings, not sketches, photographs. The actual photographic record from that period. The cities don't grow, they're revealed. 1870 photographs of Chicago show sparse development. Open lots, wooden structures, muddy streets. 1875 photographs show massive stone buildings that appear complete, fully occupied, integrated into functioning city blocks. Not half-finished construction sites, complete buildings. The official history says Chicago rebuilt rapidly after the 1871 fire. Fair enough. Except the buildings that appear in those 1875 photographs don't look 5 years old. They look weathered. They show wear patterns consistent with decades of use. The stone has aged. The mortar has settled. The architectural details show the kind of wear that comes from years of exposure, not months. I'm not saying they weren't built after the fire. I'm saying they look like they were buried, then excavated, then occupied, as if new. The same pattern appears in San Francisco. The 1906 earthquake destroyed large sections of the city. The rebuild supposedly happened quickly, but photographs from 1908 show buildings that don't look 2 years old. They look established, settled, the kind of weathering that takes time to develop, unless they weren't built, unless they were uncovered. There's a specific type of architectural detail that appears in these rebuilt cities. Ornate stonework, complex masonry patterns, decorative elements that require skilled craftsmen and significant time to execute. The official timeline doesn't allow for that level of detail to be produced at the speed these buildings supposedly appeared. Stone carving takes time. You can't rush it. A single decorative facade element might take a master craftsman weeks to complete. Yet these buildings, allegedly constructed in months during rapid urban expansion, feature dozens of such elements. The math doesn't work unless the decorative elements were already there, already complete, just buried and waiting to be revealed. I found a municipal report from St. Louis, dated 1887. It's filed in the City Engineering Department archives. The report describes excavation and clearance operations in the downtown district. It mentions removing accumulated sediment from around existing structural foundations. It references exposure of original grade levels and restoration of primary access points. That's not the language of street raising. That's the language of archaeological excavation. Except it's being described as routine civil engineering. The report never explains where the sediment came from. It never addresses why original grade levels needed to be exposed. It treats the entire operation as unremarkable maintenance work, the kind of thing cities do regularly. But cities don't regularly excavate their downtown districts to expose buried buildings, unless that's exactly what was happening, just documented with carefully neutral language that avoids asking obvious questions. The timeline keeps collapsing. Every map I examine, every photograph I compare, every municipal record I track down, they all point to the same narrow window. Something happened between roughly 1850 and 1890. Something that required major American cities to undertake massive excavation operations simultaneously across the entire continent. The official story fragments into dozens of local explanations. Each city has its reason: fire, flood, urban planning, drainage improvement. All of them plausible in isolation. But when you step back and see them all happening at once, the individual explanations start to look like a coordinated narrative designed to avoid acknowledging a larger event. What could deposit enough material to bury multi-story buildings across an entire continent? What natural process operates at that scale? And more importantly, why would such an event leave so little trace in official histories while leaving so much physical evidence in the landscape? The maps document the aftermath. They show what cities looked like after the excavation. They record the street patterns, the building locations, the infrastructure layout. But they don't explain the process. They don't acknowledge that what they're mapping isn't construction, but recovery. And that might be the most telling detail of all. The sediment itself tells a story official geology can't quite explain. I started pulling soil survey reports from the late 1800s, the kind municipal engineers filed when planning water and sewer systems. They're dry technical documents, full of measurements and composition analysis. But they contain something unexpected. Depth surveys from multiple cities show the same pattern. Beneath modern street level, there's a distinct layer of material that doesn't match the geological strata below it. Chicago's 1889 Water Department report describes unconsolidated fill material, extending 8 to 12 feet below grade across the downtown district. The report notes this layer contains fragments of worked stone, brick, and mortar intermixed with fine sediment. That's not natural deposition. Natural sediment layers separate by density and particle size. Heavy materials settle first. Organic matter decomposes at different rates than mineral content. You get distinct stratification. But this layer, the one sitting just below street level in city after city, shows uniform mixing, as if it was deposited quickly, all at once, before the different materials had time to separate. St. Louis has the same thing. An 1892 engineering survey describes artificial fill containing structural debris extending 6 to 10 feet below established grade. Philadelphia's 1894 infrastructure planning documents reference settled material of mixed composition at similar depths throughout the old city center. The language changes city to city, but the physical description remains consistent. How does worked stone end up mixed into sediment layers beneath established city streets? The conventional explanation suggests demolition debris from earlier construction, material that was spread as fill during street improvements. But that explanation requires us to believe multiple cities independently decided to demolish substantial stone buildings, grind the results into sediment, and use it as fill material, all during the same narrow time window. There's another possibility the reports never consider. What if the debris wasn't demolition waste? What if it was already there, mixed into the sediment that buried the original structures, and excavation operations simply moved it around as they cleared the buildings? Insurance maps provide unexpected confirmation. The Sanborn Fire Insurance Company began systematic mapping of American cities in 1867. Their maps are remarkably detailed, showing building footprints, construction materials, even the number of stories for each structure. They updated these maps regularly, sometimes annually, creating a time-lapse record of urban development. Pull up Sanborn maps for any major American city between 1870 and 1900. Look at how buildings appear. Not gradually, not with the progression you'd expect from normal construction. They appear in clusters, whole blocks materializing between map updates. The 1875 map shows empty lots. The 1878 map shows complete buildings, ornate facades, multiple stories, all fully realized. The maps don't show construction in progress. They don't show scaffolding or partial structures. They show absence, then presence. As if the buildings weren't being built, but revealed. The cartographers weren't recording construction. They were recording excavation results. I found something else in these insurance maps. Notations along building perimeters, small text that's easy to miss. Basement exposed. Lower story cleared. Foundation level accessed. The language is specific. Exposed, cleared, accessed. Not built, not constructed, not erected. The terminology suggests discovery, not creation. Boston's Sanborn maps from this period show something particularly striking. Between 1872 and 1880, the downtown district undergoes massive transformation. The 1872 map shows blocks marked under excavation or clearance operations in progress. By 1880, those same blocks display elaborate Victorian commercial buildings with detailed stonework and architectural features that would require years to construct. 8 years seems reasonable for such development, until you account for the Great Boston Fire of 1872. The fire destroyed over 700 buildings in the downtown commercial district. Official history tells us the area was rebuilt rapidly, a testament to American industrial capability. But the Sanborn maps show something different. The pre-fire maps from 1867 show certain buildings in the burn zone. The post-fire maps from 1880 show different buildings in the exact same locations, but with identical footprints. Not similar, identical, down to the bay window projections and entrance alcoves. As if the fire didn't destroy the buildings, but cleared away what was covering them. Railroad construction records add another layer of strangeness. During the 1870s and 1880s, America experienced unprecedented railroad expansion. Thousands of miles of track laid across the continent. The construction reports from these projects, filed with state railroad commissions, contain recurring descriptions that don't quite fit the official narrative. An 1876 report from the Kansas Pacific Railway describes cutting through previously settled earthwork while grading for new track west of Kansas City. The report notes finding structural foundations of unknown origin at depths of 10 to 15 feet below grade. The engineers documented the foundations, measured them, then built over them. No investigation, no inquiry about who built foundations in the middle of empty prairie. Just documentation and continuation. The Northern Pacific Railway encountered similar findings in 1883 while pushing through Dakota Territory. Their engineering reports reference pre-existing grading works and consolidated fill material containing worked stone along multiple sections of their route. The reports treat these discoveries as curious obstacles, nothing more. They note them, work around them, and move on. How many foundations did railroad construction uncover? How many structures did crews document, then bury again under new track? The reports exist, filed in state archives, but nobody seems to have compiled them or asked what they collectively reveal about what lay beneath the American landscape. Newspaper archives contain another category of evidence that's been sitting in plain view for over a century. Small articles, usually buried in back sections, describing archaeological curiosities or historical finds during construction projects. A typical example from the Denver Daily News, April 1881. Workmen excavating for the new federal building have uncovered extensive stone foundations at a depth of 12 feet below current street level. The construction appears to predate known settlement of the area. The article runs 6 sentences. No follow-up, no investigation. Just documentation of something that contradicts official history. Then silence. The pattern repeats in dozens of newspapers across dozens of cities. Discovery, brief mention, silence. As if there was an unspoken agreement that certain questions weren't worth pursuing. Sacramento, 1873. Foundation walls of unknown origin discovered during levee construction. Portland, 1879. Stone structures uncovered beneath Front Street during sewer installation. Cincinnati, 1882. Extensive masonry works found below established grade during waterworks expansion. Each discovery treated as a minor curiosity, each quickly forgotten, each building over what was found rather than investigating what it meant. The articles share something else. They never specify who built these structures. They never attempt to date them. They acknowledge the discoveries contradict known history, then immediately pivot to describing how construction will proceed. The cognitive dissonance is remarkable. We found something that shouldn't be here. Anyway, here's our building schedule. This brings us to the question nobody wanted to ask. If these weren't natural sediment layers, if this wasn't gradual urban development, if these structures weren't built by the cities claiming them, then what actually happened between 1850 and 1890? The evidence points toward a specific sequence. First, a depositional event of some kind, rapid enough to bury multi-story structures before they could be cleared or demolished. Second, a recovery period where cities systematically excavated and claimed these buildings as their own construction. Third, a careful documentation process that recorded the aftermath while avoiding questions about the cause. But here's what troubles me most about this timeline. The coordination, the uniformity, the way cities across an entire continent seem to have followed the same script. Excavate, claim, document, move forward. Never investigate, never question, never acknowledge the obvious impossibility of the official story. That level of coordination doesn't happen accidentally. It requires communication, planning, shared understanding of what can and cannot be said publicly. It requires institutional structures capable of maintaining consistent narratives across thousands of miles and dozens of independent municipalities. Which raises the final question this section can't avoid. Who coordinated the recovery? Who decided what story would be told about these buildings? And what did they know about what had actually buried them? The answer might lie in something we've been trained not to notice. Insurance maps. Between 1867 and the early 1900s, the Sanborn Map Company created extraordinarily detailed fire insurance maps for over 12,000 American cities and towns. These weren't decorative cartography. They were functional documents used to assess fire risk, and they needed to be accurate because money depended on their precision. What makes these maps remarkable isn't what they show, it's when they show it. Pull up a Sanborn map of San Francisco from 1899. Now compare it to photographs from 1880. The map shows buildings that appear decades old in the photographs, structures with weathered facades, established landscaping, architectural details suggesting long occupancy, yet the map dates their construction to the 1870s or 1880s, 20 years prior, maximum. The timeline compresses impossibly. Denver's Sanborn maps from 1890 document a fully developed downtown core with massive stone buildings, elaborate architectural ornamentation, and infrastructure suggesting generations of development. The official construction dates cluster between 1870 and 1885, 15 years to build an entire city centre that looks like it's been standing for half a century. You see this pattern repeated across every major American city that has surviving Sanborn documentation. Buildings that appear ancient in early photographs are officially dated to recent construction. The visual evidence contradicts the documented timeline, but nobody questions it because the maps are official, certified, used for insurance purposes. They must be accurate, right? Except the maps themselves contain anomalies that insurance assessors apparently didn't find troubling. Notations about existing foundation walls beneath new construction, references to original masonry incorporated into buildings allegedly built from scratch, measurements showing basement depths that extend far below what construction records indicate was excavated. The Sanborn maps document what's there. They just don't explain how it got there, or why the visual age doesn't match the recorded age. There's another category of evidence that's been publicly accessible for over a century, but rarely examined as a collective data set. Municipal water and sewer records. When cities installed modern plumbing systems in the late 1800s, engineers had to document what they found underground. These reports exist in city archives, usually filed under public works or utilities. They're tedious reading, full of technical specifications and engineering minutiae. But scattered throughout these documents are observations that nobody seems to have compiled into a coherent narrative. Philadelphia's water department, records from 1876, describe encountering extensive tunnel systems of unknown origin during pipe installation beneath Market Street. The report notes that some tunnels were incorporated into the new sewer system because they were superior in construction to proposed designs. Superior to 1876 engineering. Built by whom? The report doesn't speculate. Chicago's Department of Public Works documented similar findings in 1881. Engineers installing water mains beneath State Street found pre-existing conduit systems at depths requiring excavation below the water table. The systems showed sophisticated understanding of hydraulic principles and were constructed with materials that exceeded standard specifications for durability. The report recommended utilizing these existing conduits rather than building new ones. Practical decision, no investigation into their origin. Boston's records contain perhaps the most explicit acknowledgement. An 1888 engineering survey states plainly that substantial portions of the city's subsurface infrastructure predate known settlement and have been incorporated into municipal systems as discovered. MAPA. Predate known settlement. That phrase appears once, never explained, never followed up. Just a casual admission that Boston's underground contains infrastructure older than Boston itself, and everyone proceeded as if this was perfectly normal. What's striking about these municipal records is their matter-of-fact tone. Engineers weren't shocked or confused. They documented what they found, made practical decisions about what to keep and what to replace, and moved forward. As if discovering inexplicable infrastructure was routine. As if this happened in every city, and everyone understood not to make a fuss about it. That institutional comfort with the impossible suggests something worth examining. When cities coordinated their responses to buried infrastructure, they needed communication channels. They needed to share information about what worked, what didn't, how to explain certain discoveries to the public, what language to use in official documents. Those communication channels existed. They were called professional engineering societies. The American Society of Civil Engineers, founded in 1852, held regular conferences where municipal engineers shared findings and standardized practices. The proceedings from these conferences survive in library archives. They contain fascinating omissions. Sessions on subsurface construction challenges discuss soil composition, water table management, and foundation techniques. But they never discuss the elephant in the excavation pit. They never directly address what to do when you find buildings that shouldn't exist or infrastructure that predates your city. Yet the solutions they propose only make sense if that's exactly what they're addressing. An 1879 conference session titled Integration of Existing Subsurface Structures presents techniques for incorporating found infrastructure into new municipal systems. The presentation assumes such infrastructure exists, provides detailed protocols for assessment and utilization, but never states where this infrastructure came from. Another session from 1883 discusses documentation standards for anomalous archaeological findings during public works projects. The guidelines recommend brief notation in project records, minimal public disclosure, and continuation of construction without delay for investigation. The sessions read like instruction manuals for managing a situation everyone understood, but nobody would name explicitly. Professional engineering journals from this period show similar patterns. Articles about specific projects occasionally mention unexpected subsurface structures or pre-existing foundations. The mentions are brief, technical, devoid of curiosity. Then the article moves on to describing how construction proceeded. Nobody wrote editorials wondering about these discoveries. Nobody published investigations into their origins. The engineering community collectively agreed that certain questions weren't professionally relevant. That agreement required coordination, not conspiracy, coordination. A shared understanding of what fell within acceptable discourse and what didn't. Think about what that means. Engineers across dozens of cities, working on hundreds of projects, all encountering similar, inexplicable discoveries, all handling them with identical discretion, all filing similar reports using similar language, all reaching similar conclusions about how to proceed. That's not accident, that's protocol. But protocols don't emerge spontaneously. Someone had to establish them. Someone had to decide what could be said publicly and what should remain in technical documents that only professionals would read. Someone had to ensure consistency across municipalities that were supposedly independent. The question isn't whether coordination happened. The evidence makes that undeniable. The question is what that coordination was protecting. One possibility we haven't considered yet. What if the coordination wasn't hiding the discoveries themselves, but rather hiding the implications of what those discoveries meant about recent history? Because if American cities genuinely built themselves between 1850 and 1890, if that construction timeline is accurate, then the buried infrastructure and pre-existing foundations don't make sense. But if something else happened, if cities were recovering and reoccupying rather than building from scratch, then the coordination takes on different meaning. It becomes less about hiding evidence and more about managing a transition, about creating a coherent narrative for a situation that was actually chaotic, about agreeing on an official version of events that everyone could accept, even if that version didn't quite match what people had witnessed. Historical records contain hints that something like this occurred. References to reconstruction that seem oddly placed. Mentions of restoration when there's nothing documented to restore. Language suggesting continuity with something previous, but never specifying what that something was. The 1880 census contains an unusual category that appears in several state surveys. Improved existing structures, as distinct from new construction. The category disappears in subsequent censuses, but for that one decade, there's official acknowledgement that people were improving structures they hadn't built. Improving implies the structures were already there, already functional, just requiring modification for current use. Nobody seemed to find this remarkable at the time. It was recorded as statistical data, nothing more. But it suggests a widespread pattern of occupying and adapting existing buildings rather than constructing new ones. A pattern that contradicts every narrative about American frontier development and urban growth. If that pattern was real, if it was happening across multiple cities simultaneously, then coordination wasn't about suppressing evidence. It was about creating a framework for understanding what was happening, about giving people a story that made sense of what they were experiencing, even if that story simplified or restructured the actual sequence of events. The story that emerged was manifest destiny, American ingenuity, rapid westward expansion, cities built in decades through determination and industrial progress. A triumphant narrative of construction and development. That narrative required certain things to be true and other things to be forgotten. It required buried buildings to be explained as construction debris or natural sediment. It required pre-existing infrastructure to be credited to recent engineering. It required architectural sophistication to be attributed to American builders rather than unknown predecessors. And it required everyone with professional knowledge of what was really happening to maintain the same basic story, even if the details they privately documented told something different. Coordination doesn't require conspiracy. It requires shared interest. Every city engineer in 1880 faced the same problem. Infrastructure beneath their streets that predated their tenure, that nobody could fully explain, that worked better than anything they could design themselves. They had three choices: investigate and risk destabilizing the entire narrative of American development, ignore it and hope nobody asked questions, or create a framework that acknowledged the anomalies while attributing them to acceptable sources. They chose option 3. The result was a technical language that became standard across municipalities. Legacy systems for infrastructure nobody remembered installing. Historical construction for buildings with no construction records. Period-appropriate restoration for modifications to structures that somehow already existed in appropriate period style. This language appears with suspicious uniformity in municipal records from the 1880s onward. Not because engineers were conspiring, but because they were all solving the same problem. How do you document something you inherited but can't explain? The Sanborn maps reveal this most clearly. Between 1867 and 1900, the Sanborn Company produced detailed fire insurance maps of American cities. These maps are extraordinary in their precision. Every building, every material, every feature that might affect fire risk, they're publicly available now. Thousands of them, digitized and accessible. And they show something remarkable. In cities supposedly built from scratch between 1850 and 1890, the Sanborn maps from 1867 already show mature urban infrastructure. Established street grids, substantial buildings, complex utility systems, not frontier settlements, developed cities. The maps don't lie. They were created for insurance purposes, where accuracy meant money. An insurance company that accepted false building data would go bankrupt. These maps had to be correct. And what they show, over and over, is that American cities in 1867 already contained infrastructure that supposedly wouldn't be built for another decade or two. The construction timeline doesn't work, unless the construction timeline itself is wrong. Look at what happened next. Between 1880 and 1920, American cities underwent what's officially called modernization. Streets were paved, utilities were upgraded, buildings were renovated. But examine the photographs from this period. In many cases, workers aren't installing new infrastructure. They're excavating existing infrastructure, uncovering it, clearing it, adapting it for current use. The photographs show this clearly, but the captions describe it as installation rather than excavation. Why the discrepancy? Because acknowledging excavation raises questions. Excavation implies something was already there, already built, already buried. Installation suggests creation, progress, American ingenuity. The narrative required installation, so that's what the captions said, even when the images showed something different. This isn't unique to America. European cities show identical patterns. London raised its street level repeatedly throughout the 1800s. Paris rebuilt itself in ways that buried entire neighborhoods. Rome's ancient streets sit meters below the current surface. The standard explanation is gradual sediment accumulation over centuries. But examine the timeline. Many of these changes happened within decades, not centuries. Natural sediment doesn't accumulate that quickly. Something else was happening. The Great Fire of London in 1666 provides a case study. After the fire destroyed much of the city, reconstruction supposedly began immediately. But archaeological surveys show something odd. The post-fire street level sits significantly higher than the pre-fire level. Not just from debris, the entire grade was raised deliberately. Why? The official explanation is drainage improvement, but raising an entire city's elevation for drainage is an enormous undertaking. It requires coordinated effort, massive resources, and a compelling reason beyond simple utility improvement. What if the reason wasn't drainage? What if London was recovering from something that had partially buried the city, and the fire provided an opportunity to regrade everything while constructing an official narrative about rebuilding? The fire becomes a convenient explanation for changes that actually stemmed from different causes. This pattern repeats. Major fires in Chicago, San Francisco, Boston. In each case, the post-fire city sits noticeably higher than the pre-fire elevation, and in each case, the explanation is rebuilding, not recovering. The 1880 census data mentioned earlier deserves closer examination. That category, improved existing structures, appears in several state surveys, but vanishes afterward. The numbers are significant. In some counties, improved structures outnumber new construction by 3 to 1. This suggests that most development during this period involved adapting what was already there rather than building from nothing. But if that's true, where did those structures come from? The census doesn't say. It simply records them as existing, as if their presence required no explanation. And perhaps at the time, it didn't. Perhaps people in 1880 understood something we've forgotten, that the landscape contained remnants of something previous, something that didn't need discussing because everyone could see it. Only later, as that generation died and records were standardized, did the anomaly become invisible. Now we arrive at the maps that started this investigation. The 1899 maps, showing vast territories labeled differently than modern geography, suggests they should be. These aren't conspiracy documents. They're standard cartographic products from reputable sources. The Library of Congress contains thousands of them. What they show is a world in transition, borders shifting, territories being renamed, regions changing identity. All of this officially documented, all of this acknowledged at the time. The question isn't whether this happened. The maps prove it happened. The question is why we've forgotten it happened. Why does modern education present 19th century geography as stable and established when contemporary maps show it was anything but? Why do we learn about manifest destiny as if it involved settling empty land when the maps show established territories and existing infrastructure? The answer might be simpler than conspiracy. Memory is selective. Societies remember what serves their current identity and forget what complicates it. America needed a founding narrative based on wilderness taming and civilization building. That narrative couldn't accommodate evidence of pre-existing development or inherited infrastructure. So that evidence was quietly set aside, not destroyed, just archived where it wouldn't interfere with the preferred story. But archives don't destroy evidence, they preserve it. And now, with digitization, that preserved evidence is accessible again. The Sanborn maps, the census data, the municipal records, the engineering documents, all of it still exists. All of it tells the same story. Something was here before the official timeline acknowledges. Something was buried, excavated, adapted, and renamed. And everyone involved knew it at the time, but agreed to describe it differently. This isn't revelation, it's recovery. We're not discovering hidden truth. We're remembering what was temporarily forgotten. The evidence was never secret. It was simply filed in ways that made it easy to overlook. Technical archives instead of history books. Municipal records instead of national narratives. Maps instead of textbooks. The information survived, but the context that made it significant got lost. What does this mean for everything else? If the infrastructure timeline is wrong, what else might be? If coordination existed to manage one narrative, did similar coordination manage others? These aren't conspiracy questions. They're historical questions. Every society creates narratives about its past. Those narratives serve purposes. They build identity, justify present circumstances, provide continuity. But narratives are selective. They emphasize certain facts and minimize others. The buried cities aren't hidden. They're underneath us, documented in engineering reports and archaeological surveys. The inherited infrastructure isn't secret. It's recorded in municipal archives and technical journals. The timeline discrepancies aren't suppressed. They're visible in census data and construction records. Everything is there. We just stopped looking at it as connected evidence and started treating it as isolated anomalies. Maybe that's the real coordination. Not active suppression, but passive categorization. Filing evidence in ways that prevent pattern recognition. Separating related data into different archives, different disciplines, different contexts. The information remains accessible, but its significance becomes invisible because nobody's looking at it all together. The question isn't what they hid, it's what we stopped asking. And now that the question is being asked again, the evidence is responding. Not with revelation, but with confirmation. Yes, something was here. Yes, it was buried. Yes, we adapted it. Yes, we described it differently. The evidence never left. We just temporarily forgot where we filed it. The maps are still there. Every single one. The Sanborn fire insurance atlases, the municipal engineering surveys, the railroad construction reports, the census categories that disappeared after one use, the newspaper articles buried in back sections, the engineering conference proceedings with their careful omissions. Nothing was destroyed. Nothing was classified. It's all sitting in public archives, digitized and searchable, waiting for anyone who wants to look. That's what makes this different from typical historical mysteries. There's no smoking gun to find because there was never a cover-up in the traditional sense. What happened was subtler and perhaps more effective. Information was simply filed in ways that prevented synthesis. Engineering data stayed in engineering archives. Census information remained statistical. Newspaper accounts were catalogued as local curiosities. Maps were treated as cartographic products rather than historical evidence. Each piece, examined alone, seems unremarkable. An isolated anomaly, a technical detail, a minor inconsistency. But when you pull them together, when you spread out the Sanborn maps next to the engineering reports, next to the census data, next to the construction photographs, the pattern becomes undeniable. American cities didn't develop the way we've been taught. The timeline compresses impossibly. The construction methods exceed documented capabilities. The infrastructure predates its supposed installation. And everyone at the time knew it. The engineers who wrote pre-existing foundations in their reports. The census takers who created that category for improved existing structures. The insurance cartographers who documented buildings that looked far older than their official construction dates. The newspaper editors who ran brief articles about discoveries that contradicted known history, then moved on without investigation. They all saw it. They all documented it. They just didn't connect it into a narrative that challenged the emerging story of American exceptionalism and rapid development. Was that coordination? In a sense, but not the conspiratorial kind. It was professional coordination. Engineers talking to other engineers about how to handle anomalous discoveries. Municipal officials establishing consistent documentation standards. Federal agencies creating categories for census data that acknowledged reality while avoiding uncomfortable implications. Everyone solving the same problem, which was how to record what they were seeing without destabilizing the foundational narrative of their civilization. The narrative they created wasn't false exactly. American cities did grow, infrastructure was improved, development happened. But it happened differently than the triumphant story suggests. It involved recovery more than creation, excavation more than construction, adaptation more than innovation. The cities that emerged between 1850 and 1900 were built on something, and that something wasn't virgin wilderness. What was it? The maps from 1899 hint at possibilities. Territories labeled with names that later disappeared. Regions showing development that officially shouldn't exist yet. Infrastructure networks suggesting coordination across distances that communication technology supposedly couldn't manage. The cartography of that era was documenting transition, not just American expansion, but global reorganization. Borders shifting, names changing, previous arrangements being replaced with new ones, and beneath it all, literally, beneath the raised streets and regraded cities, physical evidence of what came before, the buried first floors that are now basements, the foundations that extend deeper than construction records indicate, the tunnel systems superior to 1870s engineering, the utility conduits that predate municipal installation, the worked stone mixed into sediment layers that form too quickly to be natural deposition. That evidence isn't going anywhere. It can't be demolished because doing so would destabilize the cities built on top of it. It can't be completely hidden because municipal maintenance requires accessing it. It exists in a strange state of being simultaneously visible and ignored. Everyone who works with urban infrastructure encounters it. Engineers, construction crews, utility workers. They all know the official timeline doesn't match what they find underground, but they also know their job is to maintain current systems, not investigate historical anomalies. So the evidence accumulates. Every new subway tunnel, every foundation excavation, every utility upgrade. Each project adds to the documented record of things that shouldn't be there but are. The documentation gets filed appropriately. Engineering reports, construction logs, geological surveys, all properly archived, all publicly accessible, all carefully categorized in ways that prevent anyone from seeing the full picture, until now. Because digital archives change everything. What was once scattered across 1,000 filing cabinets in 100 different cities can now be searched simultaneously. Patterns that were invisible when examining individual documents become obvious when examining thousands. The Sanborn maps didn't reveal themselves until they were digitized and made searchable. The engineering reports weren't significant until someone compiled them across municipalities. The newspaper accounts seemed like isolated curiosities until they were aggregated and mapped. The coordination that managed the narrative in the 1880s assumed information would remain siloed. Technical documents would stay in technical archives. Local discoveries would remain local knowledge. Professional discussions would happen in professional contexts. The general public would learn simplified narratives from textbooks and never examine primary sources. That assumption no longer holds. The sources are accessible now. The technical documents are online. The local discoveries are searchable. The professional discussions are archived and digitized. Anyone with internet access can do what I did. Pull the Sanborn maps. Read the engineering reports. Examine the census data. Look at the photographs. Compare the timelines. The evidence isn't hidden. It's just voluminous and scattered. But digital tools make voluminous and scattered manageable. What happens next depends on what questions people ask. The evidence will respond. It's been responding for over a century to anyone who looked, but most people didn't look because they had no reason to question the accepted narrative. Why would you? The story of American development is inspiring. The rapid growth, the technological achievement, the transformation of wilderness into civilization within a single generation. It's a story that serves purposes. It builds national identity. It justifies expansion. It provides historical continuity, but it's not quite accurate. And the degree to which it's inaccurate matters. Because if we built on something rather than building from nothing, that changes how we understand ourselves, our capabilities, our history, our relationship to what came before. We're not pioneers creating civilization in empty land. We're inheritors adapting what we found to our purposes. That's not shameful. It's human. Every civilization builds on previous ones. Rome built on Greek foundations. Greece built on earlier cultures. The process is normal. What's unusual is forgetting it happened, losing the thread of continuity, treating inheritance as if it were creation. The buried cities remember. The infrastructure remembers. The maps remember. The evidence remembers. It's been waiting in archives for anyone willing to look at it collectively rather than individually, to see patterns rather than anomalies, to ask why rather than accepting what. The 1899 maps aren't special because they're declassified. They're special because they're specific. They show a moment of transition with unusual clarity, a world reorganizing itself. Previous arrangements ending, new arrangements beginning, and underneath it all, physical infrastructure that predated both arrangements, serving whoever occupied it, regardless of what they called themselves or how they explained their presence. That infrastructure is still there, still serving, still buried under raised streets and regraded cities, still documented in engineering reports that describe it without explaining it, still waiting for the next generation to ask the questions the last generation filed away. The questions aren't dangerous. The evidence isn't forbidden. Everything is accessible. The only thing that was ever hidden was the synthesis, the connection between isolated facts, the pattern that emerges when you stop examining pieces individually and start examining them collectively. That pattern tells a different story than the one we inherited. Not necessarily a contradictory story, just a more complex one, with more layers, more continuity, more inheritance, more recovery. The maps from 1899 document one moment in that larger story. They show what was visible then, before the next wave of reorganization, before the next round of narrative simplification. They're not proof of conspiracy, they're evidence of transition, of a world that was different than we remember it being, of arrangements that preceded current arrangements, of infrastructure that served multiple occupants across multiple eras. And they're still there. In the Library of Congress, in state archives, in municipal record rooms, waiting, not hidden, just filed, not classified, just categorized, not forbidden, just forgotten, until someone remembers to look.